New York chapter.
And you will be able to see it in just a moment, I hope. There we go. I hope you can see. Evil nod if you can see it. Their thumbs are up. Very good. Okay. So if I asked you and asked the American public, which port in the United States would you associate with the transatlantic slave trade? I imagine a lot of people would say Charleston, South Carolina. Others would say New Orleans. Those would be great answers. But there are northern ports to consider too. And New York City is one of those. New York City is one of those. And here you can see New York in about 1860. And this is the moment in the 1850s and 1860s when New York is deeply involved in the traffic. So we've got two sort of unusual things. One, perhaps unusual too, that New York is involved in the traffic. And the second, that it's coming so late. This is 1850s, 1860s. We're talking about the Civil War era. And we're also talking about half a century after Congress had banned the slave trade. So the slave trade from New York in this period is entirely illegal. Let's take a wider view. The slave trade is not only illegal in the United States in the 1850s and 1860s, it's illegal pretty much everywhere. It was banned by Congress in 1808, but it was banned by Britain and by France and by Brazil, by Portugal, by Spain, by some African nations, by Haiti. Pretty much everywhere that had been involved in the transatlantic slave trade had banned it by the 1830s. So the slave trade is illegal pretty much everywhere that you can see on this map. Yet it continues, and it continues in very large scale, and New York is a big part of that picture. So what is going on that brings the slave trade to New York? New York was not a big player in the slave trade in the soon after 1808 and the congressional ban, but it became a big player, particularly by the 1850s and 1860s. So what happened? And what happened is this. In the South Atlantic that you can see here, you can see Brazil and you can see West Central Africa. These were places that were deeply involved in the illegal slave trade in the 1830s and 1840s. Now in 1850, the slave trade to Brazil is shut down for good. Most slave traders sort of melt away into other pursuits. But some slave traders from Brazil and from West Central Africa decide that they want to continue slave trading, and so they move. And the place they move to is New York City. So we're seeing a migration pattern here from places like Rio de Janeiro and West Central Africa. Well, that's like up to my next slide. So here is one of the key figures in the slave trade in New York. He's José da Silva Maia Ferreira, and he is from the South Atlantic. He is from Angola. He was born in this Portuguese colony in the 1820s. He was involved in the slave trade there, in the slave trade to Brazil. And he's one of these individuals who wants to continue slave trading. And so he'd never been to the United States before, but he emigrated there in 1853. And he moves to Lower Manhattan, which you saw on the first slide. And he is sets himself up quite quickly and quite effectively. He is a man of means. He is also a poet. He's a literary figure. He publishes poetry in New York. He marries well. He marries Margaret Butler, who you see on the right here. She was the daughter of a prominent New York physician. They get married in a Catholic church at downtown Manhattan. And they live a life of opulence. And it's fueled through the transatlantic slave trade. Last summer, I found a big group of documents, and there were letters between husband and wife, Jose and Margaret. And this was in the Portuguese archives. And you can see them, they're writing to each other while Jose, he really sails around the Atlantic world, organizing slave trading voyages, and his wife, Margaret, is back in New York. And they discuss the slave trade. Most of it is kind of concealed. They don't want to be entirely open about what they're doing, but it is clear what is going on. And as he travels and makes a lot of money in the slave trade, he sends her gemstones and expensive furs and expensive clothing items of various kinds. And they go to the opera in New York, and they dine other slave traders and wealthy New Yorkers. They are not sort of hidden away. They're not open about their work, but they are not sort of cowering in some sort of part of 5 Points or anything. They're living a kind of opulent life, and he is quite a literary figure in New York at the time. Here is a broader picture of the slave traders. I spent some time trying to dig out who they were and where they operated from. So many of you, of course, are familiar with New York, and you'll recognize what we're looking at here. It's the Lower Peninsula, and you'll be able to see Maya Ferreira on the sort of bottom left. He is working in conjunction with Cunha Reis, who is a Portuguese who also spent time in Brazil and in Africa, and Figueiredo. And Figueiredo is actually the Portuguese consul in New York. There are others there. You can see some of the Portuguese names. You can see other individuals here. Some of them are, ship builders or ship captains, or maybe they recruit sailors for the slave ships. So this is really the illegal slave trading fraternity of New York in the 1850s and the 1860s, really just as the Civil War is around the corner. Let's take a little look at what these slave traders are up to. I mean, the reason they came to New York was because it has a lot of advantages for slave traders. One is the sheer size of the port. It's the biggest port in the Americas at this point. There are a massive number of immigrants, huge number of people. And so it's somewhere where these illegal operations can be somewhat disguised. It's also a great place to purchase ships. It is a booming port, and a lot of ships are available, and these slave traders are buying up secondhand ships, which they then send off to the African coast. There are a lot of ships. There are a lot of sailors and a lot of ship captains, and you need those for the slaving voyages as well. It's also a place that has a tremendous financial capabilities, and there are a lot of merchants and banks who are ready to handle the financial transactions that go hand in hand with the slave trade, and I'm very happy to talk further about those if you like. So they're buying up ships, and here is one of them. This one's called Melodon. It sailed across the Atlantic from New York in 1854. The reason that we have this nice watercolor of the ship is because it was actually captured by the British Navy off the African coast. So this was created by a British naval officer. It's one of the ships New York ships that was actually intercepted. So you might wonder, how on earth are these slave traders getting away with it? One of the ways they do it is through disguise. They disguise their ships. I should say that these slave traders, illegal slave traders, are posing as legal merchants. They pretend to be wine merchants, importing wine from Portugal, sending ships off to Africa for various African goods like groundnuts and palm oil. And so they're sending out their ships and clearing them through the normal customs system. But they're not going to be explicit. They're not going to outfit the ship as if it's a slave ship. So you wouldn't find any shackles or anything like that on a slave ship. What you will see, and you can just about make it out here is the outline of a captured slave ship. And what you have aboard here are 4 Cs. Those are coppers. Those are for cooking food for captives, and there will be up to 1,000 captives that are forced aboard the ships. You'll see casks or barrels. Those will be containing water, and those are often filled up in New York before they went to the African coast. You also can just about perhaps make out some wooden planks, and those are going to be constructed by a carpenter on the ship during the crossing to Africa, and they will make a deck, what's called a slave deck at the time, and the captives are forced upon that deck underneath the main deck in the hold. So that is constructed on the way out to the African coast. So there's some element of disguise here, but there are other factors too. One is corruption and bribery. And I know that John talks about this quite a bit in his book as well. Some infamous characters, Isaiah Reiners is one of those, accepting bribes, very sympathetic towards slavery and to the South as well. And there are many instances of New York officials accepting bribes to let these ships go on their way. Some of them are reprimanded, most of them are not. So what is the impact? And here is a map from the book. The impact of New York, at least in terms of shipping, is this. You can see the routes of ships entering the slave trade from the United States and some also from Cuba. The vast majority of ships in the illegal slave trade in the 1850s and 1860s are originating in the United States, 80, 90%, and they're sailing under the American flag. And the American flag is protecting these ships from interference from the British Navy, which is the big threat to these slave traders. So there's an abundance of ships in New York and other American ports. They're sailing under the protective American flag. And you can see that most of them are heading out from New York, although they are heading out from other ports as well. And they're sailing across the North Atlantic following the ocean currents and wind patterns. And most of them are going to West Central Africa. And one of the reasons they're going there is because many of these New Yorkers had spent time in West Central Africa and they had good connections there, and they drew on those in order to force captives aboard slave ships ultimately. So those are the routes that the ships are taking. Now to finish the story of these ships off, here's another map from the book showing the slave trade out of Africa in the same period. So we're talking about the same ships, but going the other direction, if you will. These ships, by and large, are not going to the United States. Some of you may have heard of the illegal slave ship, the Clotilda, arriving in Alabama in 1860. That's a very interesting and important voyage. But the most common route is for these slave ships to bring captives to the Spanish island of Cuba. And Cuba was the world's major producer of sugar in this period. And sugar was grown exclusively by enslaved Africans and their descendants. So there was tremendous demand from enslavers in Cuba for enslaved labor for Africa, and the New Yorkers, in conjunction with their friends in West Central Africa, met that demand. So the vast majority are going to Cuba. Of course, the conditions on these slave ships are, as they'd always been, terrible. In fact, they're probably even worse in this period. There are, I mentioned, up to 1,000 people forced aboard these ships. There are higher proportions of children in this period than there had been before. In some cases, the majority of captives are really children. The death rate is between 10 and 20%. Much of that depended on the conditions before captives were forced aboard ships on the African coast, although it was obviously compounded by the terrible tight packing and disease outbreaks that you'd find aboard a slave ship. One other interesting point here is that in this period, there are some nations are trying to end slave trade with naval patrols. I mentioned the British. The United States does this a little bit as well, but not very effectively. And that's what you're looking at this sort of bottom arrow here. It says intercepted. We have about 30,000 or so captives who are intercepted by naval patrols. And you can see some of the destinations there. I'm very happy to tell you more about that interesting story of what happens to them afterwards. So this is a really, really terrible story, but it does come to an end. And we have a sketch of the execution of a slave ship captain called Nathaniel Gordon, and I thought I'd read a couple of paragraphs from the book to try to explain what's going on here. So on February 21st, 1862, almost a year into the Civil War, Nathaniel Gordon made his way to a specially erected scaffold at the Tombs, the city jail in New York. Gordon, a veteran slave trading captain, had completed at least 4 illegal voyages during the past decade, reputedly earning him the nickname Lucky Nat among his fellow traffickers in New York. In 1860, however, Gordon's luck had run out. Upon leaving the Congo River aboard his ship, the Erie, with almost 900 captives, he was caught by a U.S. cruiser. The Navy returned Gordon to New York, and Delafield Smith, a vigorous and effective district attorney, prosecuted him under the Federal Anti-Slave Trade Act of 1820. The jury convicted him, and Gordon was sentenced to death, despite pleas for mercy from scores of petitioners, including his wife, who were shocked by the severity of the sentence. President Abraham Lincoln declined to commute the sentence. The crowd that gathered to watch Gordon's final moments reflected how seriously the state was taking the case. You can see them there. This execution yard was packed. Robert Murray, who was the chief marshal and therefore the lead federal officer in New York, and his deputy Adolphus Borst were in charge of proceedings and appeared in full uniform. 2 state governors were also present, as was the judge and the superintendent of police. Outside the Tombs, policemen guarded the streets. Inside, 84 Marines blocked approach to the yard. Although groggy from ingesting poison the night before, a failed last-minute suicide attempt, Gordon used his last words to damn the federal government for pursuing him, giving special mention to District Attorney Smith. After he quieted down, the executioner covered his head and placed the noose around his neck. A few minutes later, his body flew up, then down, then hung suspended in air. Gordon had become the first and last slave trader to be executed under American law. So I can certainly talk more about this if you would like. The judicial system did not work, to say the least, in the 1850s and the early 1860s in New York and other American ports. And despite the fact that slave traders captured and successfully prosecuted were meant to be executed, none were. But that changed in 1862, and it reflected a broader urgency in Lincoln's administration to do something about the illegal slave trade. He also signed a treaty with the British that allowed them to intercept American slave ships. And that, in conjunction with Gordon's execution, led the slave traders in New York to get out. So just as they had come in, they left pretty swiftly in 1862 and 1863. And New York ceased to be a slave trading hub. So 1863, we see the last slave ship leaving American shores. This is truly the last slave ship, and it leaves from Manhattan. And to finish off the story, appointed 2 people. One on the left is Manuel Cunha Hayes. He was one of the slave traders. He worked very closely with Maya Ferreira. He was his partner. I can't find an image of Cunha Hayes, but he is the most notorious of the slave traders in the United States. He was sort of run out of time in around about 1860, but after the Civil War, he slipped back in, and here is his naturalization certificate. He became an American citizen, and there were no questions asked, apparently. And it's just a broader reflection of how, with the exception of Gordon, nothing really happened to the slave traders. They were never really brought to justice at all, and we can see other examples. Most of them just sort of slip away, and all is forgiven. In some ways, it's a little bit like the clemency given to Confederates after the American Civil War. On the right, we have Alawale Kasola, who was one of the enslaved Africans brought aboard an American slave ship, the Clotilda, actually, in 1860. He lived to be an old man in Africa Town, a town in Alabama, and lived with some of his shipmates, former fellow captives. And he has an incredible story. He was interviewed by Zora Neale Hurston in the 1930s, and you can read about him in the book Barracoon. So those are some of the afterlives of people involved in the transatlantic slave trade when New York was very much at the center of it. So we'll leave it there and pass it over to Jonathan.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I'm stacking up the audience's questions and trying not to put my head down next to my laptop keyboard and weep, as I'm sure you've had that experience doing your research. And yeah, Professor Wells, take it away. I mean, the hauntedness of the New York streets, absolutely riveting. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve, for inviting me, and thanks, John, for a great book and a really important book and a nice encapsulation of some of the broader themes of the transatlantic slave trade. I want to sort of zero in a little bit more on New York City. In fact, John did a great job of setting the big picture for us, although in his book, he goes also into some great detail regarding the slave trade in places like New York City. He gave us in his talk a really nice overview of how pervasive, how surprisingly pervasive this trade was, like he said, half a century after it was supposedly rendered illegal. I'm going to spend the majority of my 20 minutes or so talking about what happens in New York City streets. And I think in order to understand the origins of this entity called the Kidnapping Club, I think we need to remember that there is a part of the original US Constitution that is called the Fugitive Slave Clause. And this clause really meant that if somebody somehow, against tremendous odds, at great personal risk to themselves, managed to emancipate themselves and somehow make it to freedom in places like New York or Boston or Pennsylvania or other places where slavery had been outlawed, that did not mean, of course, that that person was in fact free. In fact, the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution required those communities to return anybody suspected of being a runaway. There wasn't much in the way of an enforcement mechanism. There's no court system that's specially set up to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause. But nonetheless, it's pretty clear from the founding of the United States that in fact, we will be divided. The country will be divided into two halves, a free half and a slave half. So it's the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution that really renders African-American lives precarious in the decades before the American Civil War. And the reason is because the police force, as well as other members of the legal system, are going to be charged with trying to return people who are accused of being self-emancipated. People are accused of being runaways. And they're going to be charged with returning those people back to enslavement. Unfortunately, as it turns out, for the 15 to 20,000 or so Black residents of places like New York City before the Civil War, the people charged with deciding the status of somebody accused of being a runaway really didn't care whether they were in fact born free or whether in fact they had escaped slavery. And that's really the crux of the issue and what allows the New York Kidnapping Club to flourish. So what was this group called the Kidnapping Club? Well, it's not a social club. It's not a well-organized group of people who socialized together or drank together, but nonetheless, it's a pretty efficient mechanism for making Black freedom precarious and fragile in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And it's really run by a couple of police officers. It's headed in part by the city recorder, Richard Riker. And it also entails the nefarious activities of some lawyers, some other judges. And even though they don't meet together or socialize together, they live close together in Lower Manhattan, which of course is a very congested area in the years before the Civil War. And they, again, even though they're not really coordinating their activities to any modern sense, it's a pretty efficient way of cheapening Black bodies. And here's really how it works. There were two officers in particular. One is a guy named Tobias Boudinot, and another is Daniel Nash. And these are members of the New York Police Department. And they are roving the streets in the alleyways and the crooked, haphazard alleyways of Lower Manhattan, and patrolling for anybody that they could even remotely peg as a runaway enslaved person. And they are pretty aware that if they charge somebody, a Black man, a Black woman, a young Black child, with being a runaway, that in fact, that person might risk their lives and defend themselves to the death in order to escape the possibility of being returned to or being taken to bondage in the South. So what Boudinot and Nash would do is they would lie. They would say, for example, we're arresting you for a crime, a burglary at the jewelry store on Broadway. And the person being arrested would, of course, say, well, I know I'm not guilty of any such crime. And so they would end up going with Boudinot or with Nash. And before they could really alert anybody in their families or their loved ones or anybody within the Black community, they would be rushed before the city recorder, Richard Riker, who is a man charged with deciding pretty much on the spot whether somebody is born free or somebody is in fact the claimed runaway. And within a few hours oftentimes, and sometimes in the middle of the night, excuse me, Boudinot and Nash and Riker would conspire to send someone into Southern slavery. Boudinot and Nash would acquire the reward, whether it was $25 or $50 reward that had been placed in a newspaper. And before anybody knew it, these people, whether they were in fact born free or in fact were runaways, were taken by ship or by railroad or by wagon coach to Southern slavery. The name Kidnapping Club actually comes from David Ruggles, and I'm going to say more about him in a few minutes. He's really the one who labels them the New York Kidnapping Club, and he publicly calls them out for their really treacherous activities. And from the 1830s through the 1840s and into the 1850s, they collectively, this group of judges and lawyers and police officers collectively make life hell for Black New Yorkers before the Civil War. And it's really, an unfortunate, horrific situation where Black New Yorkers are living in terror due to the activities of this kidnapping club. So why New York City? And I think that's an important question to ask here. And I think we should say at the outset, this is not an intention to beat up on the great city of New York, right? Which is one of our great pluralistic, democratic, progressive, metropolis in our politics and culture today. But it is to say that in order to understand how New York got great, how it became great, how Wall Street became one of the financial capitals of the entire world, how New York City in some ways became the envy of the world, is to understand its bleaker, darker past. And the fact that New York City's wealth and power were in large part built on the backs of the cotton trade with the American South. New York City is, as I argue in the book, the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And the reason is because New York City is very dependent upon the cotton trade. New York merchants, New York financiers and bankers, credit lending agencies, they are charged with facilitating all of that cotton that's grown in the South, thousands and tens of thousands of bales of cotton. And they're charged with facilitating the movement of those bales to the textile mills of places like Liverpool, England, Manchester, England, the Lowell cotton mills of New England, excuse me. And as a consequence of that cotton trade, New Yorkers make a tremendous amount of money off of the growing of Southern cotton by enslaved people. So that's really why it's such a surprisingly pro-South, even to some extent pro-slavery city in the years before the Civil War. And actually, as I'll close in a minute, even during the Civil War itself. It has a very powerful Democratic Party. And we all know the 19th century history of the political parties, which is that before the Civil War, and even to a great extent during and after the war, the Democratic Party is the reactionary, very conservative party, particularly when it comes to race. They are powered by the growing Irish working class, and they are dominated by the powerful arm of Tammany Hall. And the Democratic Party in New York before the Civil War, they do their darndest to make sure that the city is upholding its responsibility to return runaways and abiding by the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. So that's really why New York City is a place in which the kidnapping club can maneuver, can operate with really not much opposition at all, particularly from powerful white New Yorkers in the Democratic Party. New York is also, as John just pointed out, a very busy port. It's a very busy city. There are people, strangers coming from all around the world to walk Broadway and to conduct business. And it's really a city that's too busy to notice how Black people are being sucked into this vortex of the kidnapping club. I think it's important to, there's a lot of different stories in the book. Obviously true stories of people who get caught in that vortex, but I'm just going to talk for a second about one. And I think it's very painful. I think somebody wrote in the chat, how do you research such grim topics without getting depressed? And I'll tell you, it's not easy. There's a journal, a newspaper that's published during the Civil War in New York City called the New York Weekly Caucasian. And it's the premier white supremacist newspaper of the country. And as I'm reading it right now for my next book, I feel like I got to take a shower at the end of every day because it's so awful to read these stories. And this one's particularly bad. So in the early 1830s, there's a boy. His name is Henry Scott. He's only 7 years old. And he's sitting at his desk one Saturday morning, practicing his letters. And suddenly somebody knocks on the school door and the door bursts open. And there, standing before the Black students at the African Free School are two white men. One is a slave owner from North Carolina, and another is a white sheriff from New York City. And they are there to charge Henry Scott with being a runaway. And you can just imagine the chaos that unfolds in this classroom where these children are screaming, kidnappers, kidnappers. They're running in all directions. And lo and behold, they are there to arrest Henry Scott. They take him to this city jail, and they also arrest his father, who they accuse of taking Henry Scott as also a runaway. And Riker is the one in charge, unfortunately, of declaring whether Henry Scott and his father are free or whether they had been and escaped, a couple of us escaped enslaved people. So meanwhile, the white slave owner from North Carolina is not really in a position to demonstrate in a convincing way his ownership of Henry and his father. So what Riker does is he allows the white slave owner to go back to North Carolina to get the documentation and come back to New York City to prove his case. And of course, meanwhile, Henry and his father are sitting in jail while this is decided. Ultimately, the freedom of Henry Scott will be purchased in no small part to the activities of the Black community itself in New York City. And in a touching but very painful aside, the Black children, both boys and girls, in New York City collect pennies in order to try to help defend, pay for the defense of little Henry Scott. Pretty awful story, and it's pretty grim, but it reminds us how fragile Black freedom was for people in New York before the Civil War. But, as bleak as the story is, and John tells it well in his book, and I try to tell it in my book, there are heroes of the story as well. And one of the great heroes of antebellum New York City, in some ways, he's the Frederick Douglass of pre-Civil War New York City, is a guy named David Ruggles. I think I should give credit when credit is due. I didn't even know about David Ruggles until I read Graham Hodge's biography, and it's such a great biography. And then I read Leslie Harris's book and Leslie Alexander's book on antebellum New York City. And I learned more and more about David Ruggles. He's interesting in that he was born free in Connecticut, and he is just a tireless defender of racial justice in the 1830s and 1840s before he leaves New York City altogether. He's an imperfect hero because he's somebody who he's an agitator. He's not making nice like you're expected to do in Victorian society. He travels all around Lower Manhattan. He goes to New England. He patrols the wharves and docks along the East River and the Hudson River. And he really tracks down anything he can determine in regard to the nefarious activities of the Kidnapping Club. He helps to found the New York Vigilance Committee, which is a group of Black and white anti-slavery protesters. And their job, as they see it, is to counter anybody who declares a resident of the city to be a runaway. And, Ruggles is so tireless and such an amazing activist. He seems like he's everywhere at once in antebellum Manhattan. He even finds out, and this is a story that I recount in the book, he even finds out that in the late 1830s, long after New York City and New York State had provided for the end of slavery, a group, a family from Savannah, the Dodge family, are literally holding enslaved people in the heart of Brooklyn. And he goes and knocks on the door and finds that the stories are true. And one of the great things about Ruggles from a historian's perspective is that Ruggles is not afraid to call all these people out in the public. He publishes his own newspaper called the Mirror of Liberty. And he's the one who names Boudinot and Nash and Riker and Samuel Betts and others. And he's the one who records in great detail all of the deliberations of his meetings with the Dodge family in Brooklyn. And so it really allowed me to, as a historian 150 years later, to recreate some of these activities that were going on. Now, Ruggles suffers physically from all of these machinations, and so he leaves the city. But what really leads to the decline of the kidnapping club is the institution of jury trials in cases of suspected runaways. So no longer can Boudinot and Nash, rush before the city courts, and before anybody can even know what's happening, take somebody into slavery. Now you have to have a jury to decide whether somebody is free or born free or in fact an escaped slave. It doesn't make things perfect by any means, but it is a way for the activities of the kidnapping club to begin to wane. Now, it's interesting that John ended his talk and ends his book with a discussion of the hanging of Nathaniel Gordon, which in some ways I do as well, because it tries to tell us that even though New York had been such a pro-slavery, such a pro-South city throughout the antebellum years, that there's some form of, I don't know, you don't call it justice, maybe vengeance or redemption with the hanging of Nathaniel Gordon for slave trading. But it's interesting, I think, to note that even though, I think it's a writerly way of approaching the end of a story, that in fact, the story of racial conservatism, the story of white supremacy and conservative racial politics continues into the Civil War. I think New Yorkers sometimes think of their city as a place in which the progressive politics have always reigned. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The city votes overwhelmingly against Lincoln in 1860. As I mentioned, the New York Weekly Caucasian is a paper that promotes the ideology of white supremacy all throughout the 1860s and 1870s. And so this battle for the soul of New York really doesn't necessarily end with the hanging of Nathaniel Gordon for slave trading in 1862. In fact, that battle will live on. And it's part of not only the history of New York City, of course, but it's part of American history more generally. Because we like to think of American history and its founding as the story of freedom and liberty, but it's also the story of the denial of that freedom. And I think we see that particularly true in New York City in the 19th century. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to my talk.
Thank you both. That was absolutely fascinating. Wow. And as I said, the streets are haunted. And we have some great questions. Aurélie Lagrange asks two questions. One is, and Professor Wells, you covered this to some extent. I'm curious what Professor Harris does. Do you have to put your head down next to your laptop when you're in a library and you're reading something in black and white that is just so emotionally raw? And also, I guess for both of you, so the police were, many police officers were totally corrupted by this. And then the upper command, in many cases, didn't care. There was no sort of supervision of, right, of prosecuting the traitors, prosecuting the kidnappers. Is that right?
Well, I'll talk about looking at these records. It's difficult, and writing a book takes many years, and so you're in this stuff for a long time. And I had to just take breaks. I had to take breaks, and some of the most difficult things is looking at accounts of intercepted slave ships. So say British naval officers intercepting a slave ship and writing about what they saw on board. It's really awful to read. And I think that's why you have to really try to keep the humanity front and center in our books. And I think that we do that. This is an important story important stories to tell. But you have to take a step back once in a while, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. The second part of that question, Eve, can you remind me?
Right. So the whole chain of command is routed out in terms of punishing traitors, punishing kidnappers.
Well, I mean, the point I think is that's a great question. I think the point is that there aren't people who are in charge, who are looking out for the health and welfare of its Black citizens. I mean, in some ways, the entire legal system is designed to cheapen Black lives. The political system is certainly, even though it toggles between Whig and Democratic mayors in the 1830s and 40s, they're not interested in what happens to individual Black people, even though they're disappearing from the streets. So, you know, there are a small number of Black and white abolitionists. They are a tiny, tiny minority of the city. New York Vigilance Committee consists of people like Ruggles and Arthur Tappan and John Hopper and a handful of others. And they're really amazing people. And I hope I give them their due in the book. And it's really not until the 1860s until we get some degree of sympathy with these people. And, you know, it's really unfortunate that the power structure, the legal and political systems are so dead set against protecting Black civil rights.
It's wild, absolutely wild. Wendy Pitts and Catherine McKinney both ask, what happened to the 900 captives on Nathaniel Gordon's Erie? Where did they, was that immediate that he was arrested and sentenced to death? What happened to the people in between all of that chaos?
Right. So the vast majority of the interceptions don't happen in New York. I mean, almost all the ships sail off without hindrance. And the interceptions occur near the African coast. That is where the British Navy is patrolling. And so they would intercept a ship, and sometimes it would not have captives aboard it yet. Sometimes it did. In this case, it did. And then it depended who intercepted. So in this case, I think it was the British. If it was the British or the Americans, it would have two different pathways. The British would take the ship and the captives to St. Helena, which is an island in the South Atlantic, and the ship would be broken up there, and the captives would then be transported to the Caribbean, and they would enter indentured servitude in the British islands in the West Indies, where they would end up usually cutting sugarcane. And so in some ways, their day-to-day existence is not entirely different from what it would have been in Cuba. So this is one of the great tragedies. Even suppression of the slave trade does not lead to freedom, at least immediately. And there's never, I don't see any examples of enslaved Africans returning to the same part of Africa from where they came. So there are no good stories, frankly, that really come out of this, or very few at least. You know, even the intercepted captives have tough roads ahead. And if the Americans intercept these slave ships, then you've got a similar situation. Those captives, Africans, tend to end up in Liberia, which is back in Africa, but about 2,000 miles away from where they came, and they have a tough existence too. So unfortunately, that's not a very happy story either, but it's what happened.
And Harriet Risen asks, there was the Fugitive Slave Clause and then the Fugitive Slave Law. Can you just clarify that real quickly, Professor Wells? I didn't, yes. Yeah, my Wikipedia scouting is terrible on that one.
Oh, no worries. You know, it's going to be hard to do it briefly because it's such a long story that unfolds over the course of the early 19th century. But I mentioned briefly at the outset of the talk a minute ago that the Fugitive Slave Clause is in the Constitution, but it doesn't provide any really enforcement mechanism, you know, for taking those people or, you know, determining whether they're in fact free or slave. And so different states in the North handle it differently. And in fact, a series of what are called personal liberty laws are passed in states like Massachusetts, which essentially say, well, you know, yes, we have to abide by the Constitution. So we do have to send back people who are accused of being enslaved runaways, but that doesn't mean you can use our city jails for that purpose. And so in order to get a more effective mechanism for enforcing the Fugitive Slave Clause, that's why the Fugitive Slave Laws passed in 1850. And you can just imagine the terror that strikes in the hearts of Black people all across the North. And many folks have written about this, but Black people leave the country in droves. They leave Pittsburgh, they leave Cleveland, they leave New York City, and they go to Canada, which was the real land of the free in this era of American history, because that means they're going to be removed from the arm of enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law. So it unfolds in New York in really complicated ways too, that I go through in the book, but that's why there's another Fugitive Slave Law that's passed in 1850.
So George McNeely asks, so there was just the one prosecution of Gordon? That's the only death sentence in the end, right?
Yeah,
And that's not until the late 1850s even that's imposed. And George McNeely also asks if Philadelphia was any better with its Quaker origins.
Yeah, so if we were to rank them, very negative ranking. I mean, New York would be at the top, and New Orleans would be second, and Boston might be third, and Baltimore. I mean, the major port cities. Philadelphia a little bit, but not too much. It's really this core of what's called the Portuguese Company in New York. When there's a little pressure in New York, they will try to purchase ships and clear them for Africa from neighboring ports, or even from New Orleans in some cases. So they radiate outwards. In terms of prosecutions, there are others. There are several others, but there are only a couple of convictions under that 1820 law, which carries the death penalty. The other one, the death sentence, I believe, was commuted, and this was the only one, 1862, where it was actually carried out. But there are all kinds of other stories I go into in the book about jailers leaving the door open and things like this. There are escapes all the time. Juries are imbalanced, they're bribed too. There are all kinds of problems. I mean, most white New Yorkers are not terribly concerned about the transatlantic slave trade or suppressing it. It's not a major concern. It only becomes a major concern, I would say, in the North, when that slave ship arrives in the South in 1860, and then accusations fly. Oh, look, the South is opening the slave trade. And then you can imagine what white Southerners say. They say, well, you're hypocrites. And it becomes a major political issue in the build-up to the Civil War, and fosters sectional tensions between North and South.
And so that's when they actually start to, right, that's when one person actually gets condemned to death. And Maura Gallagher asks, and I had the same question too, so the Nazis left amazing records. Were both of you surprised at how much documentation survives of what was supposed to be covert? Right, there's vivid detail. You could trace down descendants of the Ferreras, right? It's in black and white, right?
Jonathan, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Yes, and I think covert may not be the right word. It's rather overt. And again, this is part of understanding the ethos of New York City before the Civil War, that white power brokers didn't care, as John just said. They weren't paying attention. And if you had asked Richard Riker, why are you so indifferent to Black lives? He would have said, well, first of all, he was deeply racist, but he also would have said something like, well, if we want to have a union with the South, if we want to keep the union intact, and oh, by the way, if we want to continue the prosperity of New York City that we're enjoying under the umbrella or framework of that constitutional government, then the cost is to periodically send Black people to the South. And that's the bargain that he willingly and eagerly made. And the idea, if you would pose to him that you would place the welfare or the well-being or the civil rights of Black people above the importance of keeping the United States together, he would have scoffed and did scoff, at that point. So I think it's really important to realize that the power brokers are looking the other way, and even are complicit. And by the way, let me say really super fast, this is not an exercise in saying, oh, look how bad slavery was in the heart of New York City, and therefore somehow diminishing the horror of bondage as it existed in the American South. Neither John nor I has any intention whatsoever of diminishing the horrific circumstances of 250 years of American slavery as it existed in the United States and in colonial America. But it is to say, again, that the denial of freedom is as part of the American story and the New York City story as is freedom itself.
I'll just
Yeah, go ahead.
jump in and add that when it comes to the illegal slave trade, slave traders are trying to hide what they're doing, to some extent at least, and they're burning their ships after voyages and they're destroying their financial records. That's key. So it is somewhat challenging to piece together, say, the financial arrangements. It is possible to do, and it's taken a lot of research to do it, but I try to do it in the book. One of the best sources I found was totally unexpected. It was a spy that the British consul in New York hired for 3.5 years, and he lived in Manhattan, and he spied on the slave traders about time, and he wrote 300 plus letters, and I found them in the British National Archives, and he lays out how it worked. And so you got to get a bit lucky in the archives to find out some of this illegal activity.
Right. So when they were prosecuted, so Comstock, the great censor of late 19th, early 20th century New York, freakishly had his spies out there writing everything down. We had a lecture by the author of a book called Everybody's Doing It about vice and dance, because these guys took amazing notes. They went out night after night and they wrote filth, raunch, and then they described everything in astonishing detail. So I have a friend whose family owned slaves horrifically in Virginia, and they even owned a coal mine. And she's joined a sort of reconciliation group where they meet, she's met descendants of African Americans whose ancestors had been in her family's area. Are you finding descendants of both the heroes and the villains of your story? Or do you try to avoid that, going too far down the ancestry.com trees?
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to, write about people who have been passed away for more than a century. But it is important, I think, to keep the memory of those who fought against the injustices alive. And that, the previous question about historical records, one of the things I benefited from tremendously is the details that Ruggles took account of when he published his newspaper. So that was really important for me.
And I'm always astonished at the loss. I'm horrified by the loss of life on those ships. And even more horrified that these guys still made money. Even with that 10%, 20% loss, they still were covered in their wives were still covered in jewelry, right? That the trade was that profitable.
Yeah, the transatlantic slave trade was, there were typically profit rates of about 9 or 10% when the slave trade was legal. So 9 to 10%, say back in the 1700s. In the 1850s and 1860s, it's about 90%, 90. So it is tremendously lucrative. There are big financial incentives, and well, you can see what it led to.
Oh, and Harriet Risen asks, could you guys briefly summarize why you chose these particular topics, why they seemed to gel together as a book?
I published a book last year called Blind No More, which was the result of a series of lectures I did on the fugitive slave law. And in part researching for that book and those lectures, I kept coming across Ruggles, and I kept coming across this thing called the New York Kidnapping Club. And as I mentioned, you know, the club is referred to, and Boudinot and Nash are referred to in different places, like Leslie Harris's book, Leslie Alexander's book, Eric Foner's book, Gateway to Freedom, that we all know and admire. And I wanted to write a book that really uncovered everything we could at least I could possibly find on this group. And that's what led me to the topic.
And John Harris, you're answering someone's question? Yes, right. We're getting these out audible.
Tempted
yes,
into
right,
the chat.
right.
Sorry.
Yes, no, it's okay.
The question was,
why did this topic seem like the perfect first book for you?
You know, it was reading somebody else's book, as so often happens, and it was somebody else's book, and a Civil War historian, and they mentioned that a slave ship had turned up in Charleston in 1858. It had been captured, and it ended up in Charleston. And I thought that shouldn't have happened. I mean, that's 50 years after the ban. So what was going on? And that led me to write a master's thesis about one particular voyage. And then that led me to New York. And then, the doctoral dissertation and other books evolved naturally, I think, from there. I wanted to understand what was going on and why. Really, that's where the origin story.
Did either of you find records of people? So there was a ton of passing going on, right? There must have been a ton of people who were half white, or looked white, who must have lived in terror of being outed by someone from their hometown, right? There must have been many, many people who came, once they had escaped, they came to New York and tried to vanish into the general population, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, at least I would think that in a city that had 300, 400,000 people, that you wouldn't run into somebody that you knew 10 years ago in Virginia. But it happened with surprising and in some cases for Black Americans, depressing frequency. Now, the problem with identifying individuals before we have these digitized and computerized records is that they were open to interpretation. And those of us who know the story of Solomon Northup, who wrote the memoir 12 Years a Slave, know that he carried free papers that were designed to provide testimony regarding his freeborn status. But those papers were easily stolen or damaged, and that's what happened all too frequently, not just to Solomon Northup, but to many Northern people of color. And so, sometimes these trials, especially when we get jury trials in the 1840s and 50s, they're these amazing performance venues where you have, lawyers on both sides presenting supposed evidence of, this person was actually not Abraham Gosley, but was Joseph Smith back in 1832, and he ran away, and he had a scar on his forehead, and he's missing his third toe on his left foot. And it devolved into this sort of dehumanizing. I mean, the whole process is so grossly dehumanizing in order to try to determine the true background of somebody who was accused. It's very fraught, to be sure.
Absolutely fascinating. Are there more questions coming in? I have one more question. Can we end on a happy note? What's the happiest story that I read in the books, in your two books, was the image of David Ruggles showing up at the brownstone and saying, "No, you don't understand. You don't have to stay here. You're not paid. You come with me." That's my happiest image. Do you have can you each give me your happiest image from the years of research?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I mean, one thing is that the transatlantic slave trade did come to an end, and it is the largest forced migration in human history, and it lasted 3.5 centuries. And this was the last gasp, and it was it was stubborn and large, and there were many people who were involved in complicity in various ways. But the United States and the Atlantic world as a whole, other nations too, was turning against it. Enslaved people always fought against their enslavement. And it took white power brokers a bit longer to get there, and many, kicking and screaming, really resisted entirely to the last. But there was a shift, and that took a long time and a lot of activism, as Jonathan points out. But there was change over time, and the slave trade did come to an end.
And Professor Wells?
Yeah, for me, I'll point to what always just amazes me. People like Ruggles and the Hopper family and the Tappins, as well as a lot of unsung, relatively unknown Black New Yorkers. Charles B. Ray is one, Thomas Van Rensselaer is another. These people who just refused to accept what everybody around them was, not only accepting, but, were complicit in. And it just reminds us that I think the meme has been going around for a long time now, but it says something like, if you ever wondered what you would be doing during the Holocaust or during, the American slavery, you're doing it right now. And it just reminds us that, activism and agitation is all of our responsibility and can't fall on, just a handful of people.
That just an amazing evening, just enlightening and haunting and heartening. I can't thank you both enough. And the streets of New York are even more vivid to me now than they were. So grateful for your time, so grateful for your efforts, your excavation, and your brilliant writing. And I think we've posted 10 times now how to buy your books. So I could not recommend them more highly. So everybody rush out, all right? Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you for having
me. Amazing evening. Mwah. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Good night, everybody. Take care.